Atlanta stirred with the pulse of a Monday morning, alive with a familiar chaos. Cars honked impatiently in the distance, their sounds colliding with hurried footsteps on cracked sidewalks. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the acrid scent of exhaust fumes, filling the damp air. Amidst the sea of commuters and their hurried routines, one figure moved with deliberate certainty: Jasmine Carter. She stepped out of her sleek black sedan, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Each stride carried the quiet authority of a woman who knew her own worth, her place, her power. Her tailored suit was crisp, her presence undeniable. She was not someone who sought attention. Rather, it followed her, drawn to her natural command of space and movement. Ahead of her, the Thompson Federal Courthouse loomed in a shade of lifeless gray, a fortress of cold stone and even colder bureaucracy. Justice was supposed to reside within those walls. But Jasmine had long understood the truth. Justice didn't live there. It visited, infrequently and with great reluctance, often bound in chains. And today, she wasn't just a visitor. She was here to ensure justice showed up. She was just 5 steps from the entrance when it happened. "Hey, hands up!" The command sliced through the morning air, sharp and absolute. It was the voice of a man accustomed to instant obedience, to unquestioned authority. Jasmine turned, her movements measured, her expression unreadable, her pulse steady. 2 uniformed officers stood in front of her, white men with their hands hovering too close to their holsters. Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks. No name tags were needed. She had met men like them before, different faces, same methods, same playbook. "Put the bag down and step back," Daly ordered. His voice was calm, controlled, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of power. Jasmine cocked her head slightly, a flicker of amusement glinting in her dark eyes. "Excuse me, what exactly is the issue?" Brooks' gaze flickered to her briefcase, his eyes narrowing as if he expected it to detonate at any moment. "You match the description of a suspect involved in fraudulent government activity." A slow, humorless chuckle escaped her lips. She let the words hang between them before responding, her tone laced with quiet incredulity. "Let me guess. Black woman. Nice suit. Carrying important-looking documents. Yeah, that's got to be real dangerous these days." Daly's jaw twitched, his patience fraying. "Just cooperate, ma'am." There it was. Not a request, a demand. Jasmine stole a glance at the courthouse doors, just a few steps away. She was minutes from leading a federal hearing, standing on the precipice of something far greater than this moment. But instead, she was here, being treated like a criminal, like an outsider, like a woman whose very presence required justification. "I don't have time for this," she said evenly. "I work here." Daly didn't blink. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. He didn't need to. Explanations from black people to white officers had never mattered before, and they certainly didn't matter now. The handcuffs clicked open. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't resist. She simply lifted her hands and let it happen, because she wasn't just playing their game. She was about to flip the entire board. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around Jasmine's wrists, the sharp clink echoing off the courthouse steps. Daly and Brooks exchanged knowing glances, their smugness palpable. To them, this was just another routine arrest, another so-called nobody off the streets, another problem swiftly handled. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't struggle. Instead, she let them bask in their self-righteous moment, let them enjoy the illusion of control they believed they had. She sat still in the back of the squad car, the city passing by in a blur of gray and muted colors. The steady hum of the engine filled the space between her and the officers in the front seat. But the silence was far from comfortable. Her heartbeat remained steady, her hands relaxed in her lap. Fear wasn't an option. She had been here before. Maybe not in this exact position, but close enough to know how the game was played. The difference? These officers had no idea who they had just handcuffed. They thought they had won, but they hadn't even begun to lose yet. The station smelled exactly as she expected, stale air mixed with the acrid scent of old coffee and sweat. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, bathing the room in an unwelcoming glow. Jasmine was led down a narrow hallway, past desks cluttered with paperwork and old takeout containers, to a small holding cell. The bars clanged shut behind her, but she barely reacted. She had time, and she knew patience was a weapon. Outside her cell, Daly and Brooks stood near the booking desk, their voices hushed, but not quite low enough. They assumed she wouldn't hear, or perhaps they simply didn't care. She had documents on her, Brooks muttered, his tone cautious. Daly exhaled sharply. We just say she tried to pass them off as real clearance files. Jasmine's fingers curled slightly against her knee. There it was. The game behind the game. This wasn't about suspicion, wasn't about protocol. It was about control, about ensuring their power went unquestioned. It wasn't enough to detain her. They had to make an example out of her. Her breath was slow, measured. Not because she was afraid, not because she was angry, because she was exhausted. Exhausted by the same tired script, by the same unchecked power, by the same men who moved through the world with a sense of invincibility, convinced that no one could touch them. But they had made one mistake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The precinct doors burst open with the force of a thunderclap, the sound slicing through the stale air like a warning before a storm. The room, buzzing with the quiet murmurs of officers typing reports and answering calls, stilled for just a moment as he walked in. Marcus Bell, broad-shouldered, sharp-suited, and carrying the kind of presence that demanded attention without a single word. He didn't just enter spaces. He owned them. Ignoring the lingering glances from the surrounding officers, he moved with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the tile as he strode straight toward the holding cells. His dark eyes locked onto Jasmine's, a silent exchange passing between them, reassurance, understanding, an unspoken promise. She's coming with me, Marcus announced, his voice calm but absolute. Sergeant Daly, leaning against the booking desk, stiffened. She's facing serious charges. Marcus barely acknowledged him. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on the desk with deliberate care. Oh, just a little something from the Department of Justice, he said, his tone edged with something dangerously close to amusement. Daly frowned but picked up the file. His hands, steady at first, faltered as he flipped through the pages. The lines on his face deepened, his jaw tightening with each paragraph he read. His eyes darted back to Marcus, as if searching for a way out. Jasmine remained silent, watching, waiting. She had no doubt about how this would unfold. Brooks, who had been standing a step behind, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. She had classified documents on her, he said, his voice suddenly lacking the confidence it had carried earlier. Marcus tilted his head slightly. And they could be forged. Daly tried, but his voice wavered. Marcus leaned in just enough to lower his voice, but not so much that the threat was lost. You mean the federal clearance documents? The ones meant for today's court hearing? His words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Daly's face drained of color. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. They were realizing, piece by piece, just how badly they had miscalculated. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice even measured. Oh, I didn't tell you. She feigned an innocent pause. Must have slipped my mind. You know, since I was in cuffs before I could even open my mouth. For the first time that day, the power in the room shifted, not with a shout or a fight, but with knowledge, with certainty. Silence stretched between them, and in that silence, realization took root in Daly and Brooks' minds. They had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The courtroom hummed with restless anticipation, a charged energy lingering in the air. The heavy door swung open, and all eyes turned, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward the unfolding drama. The reporters whispered among themselves, exchanging quick glances, their pens poised to capture every detail of what was about to transpire. At the front of the room, Sergeant Daly and Officer Brooks sat at the defendant's table. Their bodies were unnaturally rigid, their expressions carefully schooled, yet the pallor of their faces betrayed what they truly felt. They were no longer in control, no longer the ones delivering accusations. Today, they were the ones being judged. Then, The steady rhythm of heels echoed against the marble floor. Jasmine Carter walked in, her posture composed, her gaze unwavering. There were no handcuffs, no nervous glances, only the quiet authority of a woman who knew exactly where she stood. She belonged here, and more importantly, she knew it. The moment stretched, thick with expectation. From her seat at the bench, Judge Harris observed the scene with a practiced eye. Her decades of experience had given her the ability to read a courtroom like a well-worn book. She leaned slightly forward, her gaze sharp. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice steady measured, "I understand you have something to present before the court." Jasmine gave a single nod. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. Across the room, Brooks tensed, his fingers twitching against the table. Daly's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against the wood. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then, in one fluid motion, Jasmine pulled out a badge. Not just any badge, a CIA clearance badge. Gasps rippled through the gallery, murmurs swelling like a rising tide. The weight of the revelation crashed over the room in waves of disbelief. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, pens scratching against notepads, cameras clicking rapidly. Daly's face drained of what little color remained. Brooks blinked, his mouth slightly parted, as if words had escaped him entirely. The truth had landed, and it landed hard. Jasmine remained composed, watching, waiting. She had given them a moment to process their mistake. Now, she would make sure they understood just how badly they had miscalculated. The courtroom hung in a stunned silence, the weight of Jasmine's revelation pressing into every corner of the room. The air felt thick, charged with disbelief. The prosecutor fumbled with his papers, rifling through them as though some loophole might magically appear, a lifeline to salvage the sinking case. But there was none. The truth stood too tall, too unshakable. Judge Harris, ever composed, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed the moment. "Miss Carter," she said evenly, "please elaborate on your role and the nature of the documents in question." Jasmine met the judge's gaze with a quiet steadiness. Her voice was calm, unwavering as she recounted every detail. The purpose of her work, the security clearance she held, the federal hearing she had been set to attend, and the blatant misconduct of the officers who had detained her. There was no embellishment, no theatrics. Just the truth, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent her life understanding the power of facts. The courtroom remained hushed as security footage played on the monitors. The grainy black and white images left no room for interpretation. Daly and Brooks, caught in their own arrogance, had openly discussed framing her, their words captured in damning clarity. Gasps rippled through the gallery, whispers spreading like wildfire as the full scope of their deceit was laid bare. The prosecutor slumped slightly, his expression resigned. Judge Harris's gavel struck hard, a final punctuation mark on their downfall. "Sergeant Daly and Officer Brooks," she announced, her voice carrying through the chamber, "you are hereby stripped of your duties, pending further investigation. Given the evidence presented, this court finds probable cause for charges of unlawful detention, obstruction of justice, and falsification of evidence." Daly's face went ashen, his carefully crafted facade crumbling. Brooks barely moved, staring blankly ahead as the reality of their situation settled in. They had spent years believing they were untouchable. Now, stripped of their badges, they finally understood what it meant to have no power. Jasmine remained still, her expression unreadable. There was no smile, no trace of satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. Justice was meant to be impartial, not fueled by personal victories. She simply straightened her blazer, exhaling softly, as though shedding the weight of the past few days. As the court officers moved in, gripping Daly and Brooks by the arms, Jasmine turned slightly toward Marcus Bell, the hint of a knowing glance exchanged between them. "Let's get back to work," she said, her voice steady measured. There was still more to be done, and justice waited for no one. As Jasmine Carter stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt lighter, as if the weight of injustice had lifted just enough to let her breathe a little easier. The voices of reporters buzzed around her, cameras flashed, and microphones extended toward her like eager hands reaching for answers. But she moved through them with the same unwavering confidence she had carried the moment she walked in. A journalist, voice urgent, thrust a microphone in her direction. "Miss Carter, what message do you have for those watching?" Jasmine paused, letting her gaze sweep across the eager faces before her. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice steady. "This is a reminder that truth matters, that accountability matters, and that no one, no matter how powerful, should be above the law." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was no longer just about a single case. It was a moment that stood for something much larger, a shift, a reckoning. Marcus Bell stepped beside her, his presence solid, his knowing smirk never quite leaving his face. "Ready to take on the next fight?" he asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Jasmine exhaled, a slow smile forming. "Always." She turned back to the cameras, her expression serious once more. "For everyone watching, I have one question. How many times has justice been denied to those without the resources to fight back? Today, I had the privilege of proving my innocence. But what about those who never get the chance?" A hush fell over the crowd. The weight of her words hung between them, undeniable, inescapable. "This isn't just my story," she continued, her voice resolute. "It's the story of countless others who have been silenced, dismissed, and mistreated. If you believe in justice, if you believe in fairness, then speak up. Don't let injustice go unchecked." She let the moment settle, let the gravity of her message take root. Then, with a final glance toward the cameras, she made her last call to action. Like, share, comment, keep this conversation alive. Because the more we expose injustice, the harder it becomes for it to hide. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustling city, ready for whatever fight lay ahead.